The letters lay scattered across the wooden floor like fallen leaves. Dozens of them, years of them, each one a piece of her heart-made paper. Catherine Monroe knelt among them, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the one she'd just opened, the one that wasn't in his handwriting. Her brother stood in the doorway, his face twisted with guilt and something worse than guilt, shame, the kind that eats a man from the inside out. She looked up at him with eyes that had cried themselves dry hours ago. Past tears now, past everything but the hollow ache of betrayal so complete it felt like dying. For 3 years she'd survived on these letters. 3 years of waiting, of hoping, of believing that somewhere out in the territories her husband William was fighting to come back to her. That every word he wrote was a lifeline connecting their hearts across the impossible distance. She'd read 'em every night before sleep, traced his words with her fingers, memorized passages that got her through the darkest moments, when the crops failed, when her mother died, when loneliness threatened to drown her. The letters were her faith made tangible, proof that love could survive anything. Except they weren't his letters. They were her brother's, Thomas, her own blood. Writing her for 3 years in William's name, forging his handwriting, spinning stories of battles and campaigns and promises to return. While William had been dead for 2 years and 7 months. Catherine's voice came out as barely a whisper, asking the question that would haunt her forever. She asked Thomas how long he'd known, how long he'd let her love a ghost, how long he'd watched her wait for a man who was never coming home. Thomas couldn't answer, could barely breathe, could only stand there watching his sister's world collapse, knowing he'd been the one holding the hammer. And then Catherine asked the question that broke them both. She asked if any of it had been real, any of William's love, any of his promises, or if everything she'd believed in for the last 3 years was just another lie written in her brother's hand. The silence that followed was so complete, even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Let me ask you something, friend. If someone you trusted told you beautiful lies to protect you from ugly truth, would you thank them for the mercy or curse them for the deception? If love letters kept you alive through unbearable grief, does it matter who wrote them? Catherine Monroe had survived 3 years of hardship on the strength of words that weren't real. She'd found hope in promises that were never made. She'd loved a version of her husband that existed only in her brother's imagination. But here's the question that cuts deeper than any blade. Was the love she felt any less real just because the letters were lies?
4 years earlier, William and Catherine Monroe were the kind of couple that made other folks believe in love. He was a cattleman's son with honest eyes and capable hands. She was a school teacher's daughter with a sharp mind and a gentle heart. They'd known each other since childhood, grown up on neighboring ranches, fallen in love so naturally it felt like breathing. They married young, built a modest home on land William's father gave them, and planned a life full of children and laughter and all the small beauties that make a marriage rich. But then, the war came. Not the big war back east that everyone talked about, a different kind of war. A territorial conflict that needed men who could ride and shoot, who knew the land and weren't afraid to defend it. William felt the call of duty like a rope around his chest. He believed in protecting what was his, what was theirs, what would belong to their children someday. Catherine begged him not to go, not because she didn't understand duty, but because she felt something dark hovering over the decision, a premonition she couldn't name. But William went anyway, promising he'd be back before their first anniversary, that he'd write every week. The distance would only make their love stronger. And for the first 6 months, he kept that promise. His letters arrived like clockwork, full of details about camp life, descriptions of the territory, reassurances that he was safe and thinking of her every moment. They were beautiful letters, honest and raw, the kind that made Catherine fall in love with him all over again with every page. She wrote back just as faithfully, telling him about the farm, about the neighbors, about how much she missed his touch, his laugh, his presence beside her in the night. Her brother Thomas lived on the neighboring property. He'd always been protective of Catherine, maybe too protective. He was older by 5 years, never married, devoted his life to the ranch and to looking after his sister. He didn't approve of William going to war, thought it was reckless, selfish even, to leave a young wife alone. But he respected Catherine's feelings enough to keep his opinions mostly quiet. Then, the letters from William stopped coming. 1 week passed, then 2, then a month. Catherine grew frantic with worry, writing letter after letter that went unanswered. She couldn't sleep, could barely eat, spent every day watching the road for the mail rider. Thomas watched his sister waste away with grief and helplessness, and it carved him hollow. Then, 2 months after the letters stopped coming, an officer arrived with news that shattered Catherine's world into pieces too small to gather. William had been killed in an ambush, swift and sudden. They'd buried him with honor in the territories, far from home. Catherine collapsed, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like a building crumbling from the inside out. She stopped teaching, stopped tending the house, stopped doing anything but sitting by the window, hollow-eyed and silent, waiting for something that would never come. Thomas was terrified he'd lose her too, that grief would take his sister the way war had taken her husband. He tried everything, tried to comfort her, to help her, to pull her back from the edge. Nothing worked. Until one desperate night, Thomas got an idea that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He found William's old letters, studied the handwriting, practiced until he could mimic it almost perfectly, and then he wrote Catherine a letter as if it were from William. He kept it simple, apologized for the silence, blamed it on being moved to a remote outpost with no mail service, and promised to write more often now that he could. He slipped it in with the regular mail delivery, watched Catherine open it, watched the color return to her face like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. She came alive again, started eating, started tending the farm, started living. And Thomas realized he'd found the only medicine that could save her. So he kept writing. Every week, sometimes twice a week, Thomas would write letters in William's hand. He crafted them carefully, making them sound like William, feel like William, carry all the love and longing that William would have written if he could. He described imaginary battles, created stories of bravery and hardship, wove a narrative of a man fighting to return to the woman he loved. And Catherine devoured every word. She believed completely. Why wouldn't she? The handwriting was perfect, the voice felt real, and she needed them to be true more than she needed air. The letters became her lifeline. When the drought hit and the crops withered, William's words gave her strength. When her mother passed away suddenly, William's promises gave her hope. When loneliness threatened to swallow her whole, William's love kept her afloat. Thomas told himself he was doing the right thing, that these lies were mercy, that keeping Catherine alive and hopeful was worth the deception. But guilt aided him like acid. He watched his sister build her whole existence around a fantasy he'd created, watched her plan for a future that would never come, watched her love grow deeper for a man who was bones and distant ground. And as the months became years, Thomas found himself trapped in a web of his own weaving. He couldn't stop writing the letters without destroying Catherine, but every letter he wrote dug the lie deeper, made the eventual truth more devastating. He tried to prepare her gently, started writing letters where William talked about how war changes a man, how he might come back different, how maybe she should consider what life would look like if he never returned. But Catherine wouldn't hear it. She wrote back with fierce devotion, insisting that nothing could change her love, that she'd wait forever if she had to. So Thomas kept writing, kept lying, kept watching his sister love a ghost he'd animated with ink and paper. Until the day Catherine found the drafts. Thomas had hidden them in his desk, all the practice attempts, the notes where he'd planned out storylines, the samples of William's real handwriting he'd used as reference. Catherine had come to borrow a ledger book and found them by accident. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. Then, piece by piece, horror by horror, the truth assembled itself in her mind like a nightmare taking shape. Every letter, every word, every promise and profession of love for the last 3 years, all written by her brother. All lies.
Thomas tried to explain through his own tears, tried to make her understand that he'd done it out of love, out of desperation to save her, out of fear that losing William would mean losing her too. But Catherine couldn't hear him through the roar of betrayal in her ears. She felt like a fool, like her entire life for the past 3 years had been a performance she'd given for an audience of one, dancing to music only she could hear. Worse than that, she felt robbed of her grief, robbed of her chance to heal honestly, robbed of the natural, terrible process of learning to live without the man she loved. Thomas had stolen that from her by trying to protect her from it. The anger was a living thing inside her, hot and wild. She wanted to rage at him, to hate him, to cast him out of her life forever for what he'd done. But underneath the anger was something more complicated. Because the truth was, those letters had saved her life. Without them, she might have withered away to nothing in those first dark months. The lies had given her reason to wake up, to work, to survive. And the love she'd felt reading them, the hope they'd kindled, the strength they'd given her, all of that had been real, even if the letters weren't. Catherine sent Thomas away that night, told him she needed time, space, silence to figure out who she was without the fiction he'd created. The weeks that followed were the darkest of her life, darker than even when she'd first learned of William's death, because now she had to grieve twice, once for the husband she'd lost, and once for the version of him she'd loved through the letters. She read through William's real letters, the ones from those first 6 months, over and over, memorized his actual voice, his real words, the genuine love he'd given her before the war took him away. And slowly, painfully, she began to separate truth from fiction. She realized that William had loved her completely, that his real letters proved that nothing Thomas wrote could diminish what they'd actually shared. She also realized that Thomas had loved her too. Not romantically, but with the fierce, protective love of a brother who'd been willing to destroy himself to save her. His lies had been wrong, deeply, unforgivably wrong in many ways. But they'd also been an act of love from a man who had no other way to help. 3 months after she discovered the truth, Catherine rode to Thomas's ranch. He looked like he'd aged 10 years, hollow-eyed and broken, carrying the weight of what he'd done like stones in his chest. Catherine didn't forgive him. Not right away. Not easily. But she told him she understood why he'd done it, that she could see his love even through the deception, that she was choosing to believe his intentions even while hating his methods. She told him that the letters had saved her life, but discovering the truth had given her something just as important: her autonomy, her right to grieve honestly, her chance to heal for real. She told him that moving forward, she needed him to respect her strength enough to never lie to her again, to trust that she could survive truth no matter how brutal, better than she could survive deception, no matter how well-intentioned. And she told him that forgiveness would take time, maybe years, maybe forever, but that she wasn't ready to lose her brother too. Not if he could learn from this, grow from this, become someone worthy of her trust again.
Thomas wept and promised he would spend the rest of his life proving himself to her. Catherine went home and finally, truly began to grieve William. Not the imaginary version who'd fought battles that never happened and made promises Thomas invented, but the real man who loved her fiercely and left too soon. It was harder than anything she'd ever done, but it was honest. And honest pain heals cleaner than pain wrapped in lies. In the years that followed, Catherine rebuilt her life. She went back to teaching. She tended her farm. She learned to carry William's memory without letting it crush her. Thomas kept his distance, but he kept his word too. He never lied to her again. Slowly, carefully, they rebuilt something like trust. And Catherine learned the hardest lesson the frontier has to teach: that love requires truth, even when truth is brutal. That protecting someone from pain might keep them breathing, but it robs them of the strength they'd gain from surviving it. That the greatest gift you can give someone isn't comfort, but the belief that they're strong enough to handle a reality. She learned that grief isn't something to be avoided or managed or cushioned with gentle lies. It's something to be walked through, step by painful step, until you come out the other side, changed, but whole. So that's the story of the letters that kept Catherine alive, and the lies that almost destroyed her. A tale of love twisted into deception, mercy that became cruelty, and the long, hard road to forgiveness when someone breaks your heart trying to save it. If this story stirred something deep in your soul, then don't write off just yet. There are more stories waiting beneath the western sign. Tales of love, betrayal, and lessons learned the hard way. Subscribe to Frontier Love Tales, where every story reminds us that love still rides, even across the roughest frontier. Because out here, the truth is simple. Love built on lies might keep you breathing, but only love built on truth can keep you alive. Trust the people you love to be strong enough for reality. And if someone lies to you out of love, remember this: you can honor their intentions while still demanding better. Because real love respects strength more than it fears pain.